For the past 2 weeks, we have been looking at the book of Galatians. Week before last, we looked at Galatians chapter 3, most of it, and then last week we went through the end part of chapter 3 from verse 19, and we went over to chapter 4. Now, we will continue today with our study because we have not finished looking through Paul's statements. And if it seems like we're spending a lot of time on this, I'm going to justify it by saying, if the Bible spends a lot of time on it, we should spend a lot of time on it. Paul makes his point, but then he goes through and he reinforces the point, and then he continues and he uses another way of making the same point. That is one of the things that impresses me as I look at the writings of Paul, and especially if you go through a book like Galatians here, which is one of his shorter letters, just 6 chapters, but still he compacts so much into that short space. Or the book of Romans, for example, he deals with things that are vital to understanding and experiencing Christianity. And even though Paul wrote 2,000 years ago, the reason why these messages are so vital today is because the same issues continue to come up in the Christian church. The same issues continue to come up in our little movement. So, it's a good thing that we have the word there to continue to straighten us out if we look at it closely. One of the things that is very disturbing, interesting and disturbing, is that people will use the same passages that we are going through. They will use the same verses, the same writings of Paul, and they will try to use it to say the opposite of what we have been looking at. That's very interesting, and that is one reason why we want to take our time and do a thorough study to make sure we understand what is being said. That is very important. There's a phrase that I use over and over because it keeps jumping out at me every time we come to do a study of the Bible, and it is the statement that many times we cannot see the forest because we are looking at we cannot see the trees, and so we cannot see the forest. We cannot see the forest because of looking at the trees. And it emphasizes the great fault that people have, not just in terms of studying the Bible, but almost in everything in life. You become so fixated on little details that you don't see the big picture. And if there's anything I've benefited from in my life, if I would tell you the greatest tool I have obtained in trying to understand things is that I have learned to try to get the big picture. What is the overall message? If you can get this, the little parts are easier to understand. And I found this especially interesting in looking at the book of Revelation, Daniel, but also in looking at these writings of the Apostle Paul and the Bible in general. So we're going to go back to the book of Galatians today, and we will pick up from where we stopped last week. But let me just reinforce the message we have been getting so far. What Paul says is that God devised a way of repairing the broken relationship between himself and man. God devised a way of blessing the entire race. There was one way, and there was only one way. Never two. Nothing to be added to it. Nothing could be taken from it. One single event, or one single method, if I may put it that way. And that method was, he was going to send somebody that he referred to as the seed. Now what we have seen so far is that God gave a promise that he would send this seed. But it took 4,000 years before the seed arrived. God gave the promise in the Garden of Eden. God repeated the promise to Abraham, actually brought Abraham into the stream through which that seed would come. But until the seed arrived, God put a system in place that was a temporary measure, temporary. I refer to it as a stopgap. And that temporary measure was he put those who were called his people under the system called the law. Sometimes it is referred to as the Old Covenant. It was a system called the law. It was not a method of bringing men to God. It was not a method of saving men. It was not a method of bringing the blessing to men. It was a method of controlling, first of all, and secondly, of teaching. It was to teach and to control. And so the law was a stopgap until God's promised way arrived. And Paul says that promised way arrived when the faith of Jesus became reality. Jesus came. At that point, we no longer were, God's people were no longer under the governance of the law, no longer under the dominion of the law. God's true method had arrived. And that method was to bless the world, to bless each individual, to accept and receive each individual through the seed. And so he says, so if you belong to Christ, you're Abraham's seed. You're all the children of God by faith in Jesus Christ. So that's the essence of what we looked at so far. And this is so strong an emphasis in his message. It's hard to read it with an honest heart and come to any other conclusion. So, but it is amazing that people do. People do. There are people who try to say, okay, it's the seed if you keep the law. Or it's the seed, but the purpose of the seed is to bring you to the law. The law is made the center, and Jesus is a means of supporting the law. Jesus is a means of getting you to keep the law. The whole point is the law. And that is wrong. That is not the message that Paul is giving at all. You know, I think even before we go to the Bible, I think there is such a distortion of what God wants, and that is a problem. There are people who are so oriented legally that they think that God's whole purpose from beginning to end, God's whole purpose was to defend the law. That the law is a central issue in the universe. And so even why God sent Jesus and why God even made us justified by faith is so that he could bring us to the place where we would keep the law, because the law is the center. But that is absolutely not true. The whole point of the universe is relationship. The whole point is relationship. What God wanted was a relationship with people where we could be his family, where we could be his friends, where he could be comfortable with us, where the barrier between us and God was taken away. The problem between us and God was that we didn't trust God. It wasn't our performance that was the problem. It was our trust that was the problem. Now somebody may say, if you trust, then your performance will be right. That is true. But that is not the point. The performance is incidental. It just happens to be there. That is not the point. The point is the trust. So I want my child to behave properly. But what is of maximum importance to me is that my child and I have a relationship where we are friends. If we are friends, I mean, Brother Gregory was kind of touching on a little bit of this earlier on. But where my child and I are friends, are somebody, where the relationship is there, performance is easy to obtain if that is important. It's easy to get a person to do the things that you think are best if you are good friends with a person. The problem that God had was that man's relationship with him was broken because man stopped trusting God. People think it was about breaking a rule in Eden. It wasn't the broken rule that was a major problem. It was the broken trust. It was the broken trust that was a problem. Satan got Adam and Eve to stop trusting God. And when they stopped trusting God, the broken rule followed very simply. And the whole problem that God has is rebuilding that broken trust so that we would let God back into our lives. And this is what he proposed to do through the seed. That is why Jesus is everything. He's everything. So people are trying to make Jesus a means to keeping the law. That's nonsensical. Jesus is the means to the restored relationship. And the law comes in as an incidental thing. It just happens to be a part of the benefit that comes from the relationship. So we need to get it right. Anyway, let's go now to the book of Galatians, and we'll continue from where we left off last week. So I'm going to put up Galatians chapter 3 and Galatians 4 on the screen, because again, I want us to be certain that some of the things we are looking at are simply a repetition of something that Paul said already. Now last week we looked at the last part of Galatians 3. So you have Galatians 3 in the left panel. And we have Galatians 4 in the right panel. I don't want you to be confused. So at the last part of Galatians 3, we saw that God's people were kept under the law. Why were they kept under the law? It was before faith came. And what did we mean by the coming of faith? It says that what we are talking about, we come unto Christ that we might be justified by faith. After that faith is come. Remember, I made a point about the word that. I would normally read it, but after that faith is come, meaning faith. But no, that's not how it should be read. But after that faith, that particular faith, and that faith is the faith of Jesus Christ. Let me see, where does it say? It says it's somewhere here. The faith of Jesus Christ might be given unto them that believe. You know, the way Paul is using the word faith here is like when we talk about I am of the Christian faith. I am of the Christian faith. Or I am of the one God faith. The one true God faith. When we use the word faith here in this sense, we don't mean the confidence you have in God or in what he says. It means the religious atmosphere that surrounds your life. The religious atmosphere that surrounds our life is the faith of Jesus Christ. That is my faith. So this is what Paul is talking about when he says, he talks about the faith of Jesus Christ. And so he says, when that faith is come, when that faith, the faith of Jesus Christ, the religion centered on Jesus Christ, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. And what he means is that we are no longer under the law. The law was our schoolmaster. So we looked at chapter 4 and we saw where it says that the child, even the heir, the one who is the heir, remember it said at the end of chapter 3 that if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and you are an heir, the one who inherits. You are an heir according to the promise that God made to Abraham. The word heir we emphasized. And then you go to chapter 4, which is that I beg your pardon. Somebody's going to tell me to drink lime and honey or whatever. Let me see if some water will do. All right. So there are no chapter divisions in the original. Paul did not put in chapters and he didn't put in verses. So it says, you are heirs according to the promise. Now the heir, same person I just mentioned, as long as he's a child, as long as you are a young person, as long as you are an infant, you're no different from a servant. And we explained that he didn't mean you're a servant because you're going to be worked like a dog. You're a servant because you don't have control over your own actions. What is it that controls your actions? He is under tutors and governors. They control your behavior until the time appointed of the Father. The time appointed of the Father is when you become an adult, when you get to 21 or maybe 18. You have certain places where the ages are different. But you, the child of God, we the children of God, the church of God, the body of God's people were placed under teachers. Well, as people have pointed out repeatedly, it doesn't really mean teachers necessarily. It means a kind of governor who was put in charge, who would not only teach the child but make sure that he was taken safely around and his life was under control all the time. But anyway, teachers and governors will do. He's under teachers and governors until the time that the Father appoints. So we come back to chapter 3, and it says that the law was our schoolmaster. It's talking about the law. The law was our tutor and our governor. It's talking about the law until the time appointed by the Father. And the time appointed by the Father is the time when faith is come. It's the time when Jesus Christ arrived. At that time, we are no longer under a schoolmaster. The child is under a governor, a schoolmaster, and he's growing up, and the schoolmaster takes charge of his life and tells him everything he's to do. And one day the child comes to 21, and he's now an heir. And at this point, he tells the schoolmaster what to do. The schoolmaster doesn't control his life anymore. He becomes lord of the schoolmaster, lord of the governor, once he has come of age. And Paul is using this illustration and saying that once we, the people of God, and he's including the Galatians, the Jews, every Christian, once upon a time we were children. We were under these tutors and governors, which is the law. And after he tells the story, he makes it clear what his parable means. He talks about the heir being under tutors and governors. He uses a story from real life, an illustration from real life. And then he says, now this is what I mean. Even so, or in the same way, we who? We Christians, we the people of God. He's not talking about Jews, because otherwise he wouldn't say we, because the Galatians were not Jews. He's not talking about Galatians, or else he wouldn't say we, because he was not a Galatian. So he's talking about both Galatians and Jews and Greeks and anybody else, male and female. We were once, we the people of God, when we were children. That means we were spiritual children. We were once in a state of spiritual infancy. We were in bondage under the elements of the world. Now he uses the word bondage, and last week we looked at this and we saw that this word is used in the book of Galatians over and over to refer to the government of the law, over and over. We're going to look at that again today a little bit. But he says we were in bondage under what? He calls it the elements of the world. Now anytime you talk about worldly elements, we people in the 21st century, we think negatively. Because if they call you a worldly person, it's negative, right? If they say your religion is worldly, what we think about is people wearing earrings and have on makeup and wearing chains and short dresses. And if you say your religion is worldly, we think about people who are obsessed with money and so on. If we talk about the worldly religion, this is not what the word means in the Bible, at least in this part of the Bible. When it talks about worldly elements, it doesn't necessarily mean something negative like what I just mentioned. What it means, a lot of the time, it means things that are limited to this life. For example, this is a worldly thing. It's a pen. It's a worldly thing. This is a worldly thing. My phone is of the world, right? It is not spiritual. It has nothing to do with the life to come. That is what Paul is talking about. So in the same vein, I'll just show you quickly where the word is used. Another place in the Bible that makes it clear what it really implies when it talks about worldly elements or elements of the world. If you look at the book of Hebrews, look in the right panel, Hebrews chapter 9. Look at what it says. Then verily or truly, the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. Now today, if you say you are going to a worldly church, everybody will understand you to be saying, understand it to mean that you are going to a church where there's not a lot of modesty and where people are not interested in spiritual things. You know, they may be fixated on money making, they may be fixated on politics, they dress up like the world. So you say it's a worldly church. But in the Bible here, when the word worldly is used, it doesn't mean that. It means it is made up of worldly things. The sanctuary was made up of board. It was plated with silver and gold in some cases. It was made of shittim wood, acacia wood. It was covered with animal skins. It was of this world. It was worldly. It was not spiritual, and that's what Paul means when he says there was a worldly sanctuary. And it is the same thing he means here in Galatians when he says that we were under the elements of the world. That's something I would like us all to thoroughly understand and to be able to explain. Because when you meet upon these people who are, you know, the Bible says it, and it's to understand what the Bible means. Elements of the world. What was it that governed them? Okay? Even the Ten Commandments. Where was it? It was written on stone, 2 pieces of stone. And if you say that God made the first 10 and it was divinely crafted, who made the next? When Moses broke it, where did the other 2 come from? Moses carved it out of stone. He found 2 pieces of rock and he made it, and then God wrote on it. It was still of the world. It was made out of stone. Everything in their religion was of this world. When they committed sin, they got an animal and they got blood. They had to eat bread and drink wine and to pour wine and oil. Everything was taken from this world. It was elements of the world, things that belong to this life and this planet. Paul is contrasting that to spiritual elements. The things that are spiritual are not made of wood and stone and animal blood, not even literal blood. The things that are spiritual are the things on which our religion is centered, and they are not elements of this world. This is what Paul is saying. So he says, as we continue into verse 4, but when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. Now, there's a little mixing of his illustration here, but I'll comment on that in just a while. Now, Paul says, first of all, that it was when the fullness of the time was come. And what is this referring to? If you go back to chapter 3, if you go back to verse 19, it says, wherefore then serveth the law? What was the purpose of the law? It was added because of transgressions, and here's the point, till the seed should come. Again, you see, the law had a time limit on it. The tenure of the law, the administration of the law had a time limit. It was like, you know that in 3 years' time in America, there's going to be an election, and if things go normally, then the tenure of your present president and administration will come to an end, or may come to an end, right, if things go normally, and you'll have another administration. So there's a time limit, and that is what the Bible is saying. There was a time limit for the law, and that time limit was till the seed should come. And here it says in verse 4 in chapter 4, when the fullness of the time was come, the time limit was up. And so, of course, the fate of Jesus has come. So God sends forth his Son, made of a woman, and it says he was made under the law. Now, that's one of the key verses that make you understand what being under the law means, right? Now, I have had people, in all seriousness, tell me And mostly they were feast keepers, of course, because they have a horse in the race. They have a reason for trying to say it's not speaking about what it says, right? It says, being made under the law means that Jesus was condemned by the law. I think if you have ever had discussions with the average law-keeping person, there are hundreds of them out there. There are not many people who will understand it the way we understand it. But I will tell you, most of them will tell you that being under the law means that you are condemned by the law. So when we commit sin, we are under the law. And when we are forgiven of sin, we are no longer under the law. That's how they see it. And they actually go through Galatians chapter 3 and they try to make that fit into Galatians chapter 3. So they say, we were under the law because we were condemned by the law, but when we have faith in Jesus, the law no longer condemns us, and so we are no longer under the condemnation. But if you sin again, you go back under the law. So it's like several times a day, maybe. You're under the law. You say, please forgive me. You're out from under the law. You commit sin again tomorrow. You're under the law. You say, please forgive me. You're out from under the law. And that is how they perceive it. But as you can see, this is absolutely a perversion of what is being said. Paul is talking about not your personal experience. Paul is talking about a timeline. The promise made, 430 years to the law. Then the law comes and the law is in power, if you want to put it that way. The law is in control until the seed comes. And when the seed comes, the fullness of the time comes. God sends his son, and the son is made under the law. So what does under the law mean? It means simply to be under the government of the law. Jesus was not condemned by the law. They say he was condemned on the cross. Okay, if you want to say he was condemned on the cross. But the Bible says he came into the world under the law. And what they have said to me is that from the moment he was born, he was condemned. He was under condemnation. And I said to them, if this is true, then how could Jesus have been in the favor of God? How could God have blessed Jesus' life like that when he was condemned by the law? When you are condemned under the condemnation, it means that there is no grace for you. It's Jesus who takes us out of condemnation. Until we accept Christ, we have no relationship with God. According to the Bible, where was Jesus made to be sin? According to the Bible. Let's go back to the book of Galatians, where we find it clearly stated in Galatians chapter 3. Look at what it says. It says in verse 13, Christ hath redeemed us from the curse of the law. All right? Being made a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone that hangeth on a tree. When was Jesus made to be sin for us? It was when he hung on the tree. It was when he hung on the tree. Let me show you another place. If I can find it quickly. Let me show you another place where it says the same thing. Yes. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 24. Look at what it says. Who his own self bare our sins in his own body. So he did. But where? On the tree. On the tree. It was on the tree that Jesus was made to be sin for us. And you know it to be true because it was on the tree that Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? When the Bible says, he has made him to be sin for us who knew no sin. Let us be clear. This does not mean that Jesus took our body. That is not when Jesus was made sin. It doesn't mean he was born of a woman. That's not when he was made sin. Jesus was made to be sin when he hung on the cross. That is why at that point, God abandoned him. God turned his back on him because on the cross, God was treating Jesus in the way that sin deserves to be treated. For the rest of his life, he was in the favor of God. It was only on the cross that he was separated from God. So when the Bible says that God made his son under the law, it doesn't mean that he was made under the condemnation of the law. He was under the law because he was born under the jurisdiction of the law. That's the word I was looking for. Under the jurisdiction. That means he was under obligation to obey the law. That is why when he was a boy, they took him and they circumcised him. That is why he observed the feast days and all the rules of the law, because all of these were in place until Jesus died. Until Jesus died. The real plan of salvation never went into implementation until the Passover died. That was the beginning. That was the beginning of the journey from Egypt to Canaan. It's the beginning of the journey from sin to redemption, and it started with the death of Christ. Up to that time, the law was still relevant. That is why Jesus says, do not think that I have come to destroy the law and the prophets. I've come to fulfill them. Therefore, whosoever will break one of the least of these commandments and teach men so, he shall be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. Because the kingdom of heaven was coming. It was coming when Jesus was glorified and the day of Pentecost came. Then it was the beginning of the kingdom. Those who entered into the kingdom, if they had been people who were teaching the abolition of the law before the time, they would have been the least in the kingdom. That's what Jesus was saying. So Jesus always encouraged people to keep the law while he was here on earth, because he was made under the law. You know, people have a habit of saying, I'm following Jesus' example. If Jesus kept the feast days, I'm going to keep the feast days. If Jesus told people that in order to be saved, you have to keep the law, I'm going to teach that. And this, again, is based on another form of ignorance, because, you know, this morning, Gregory mentioned something about that, something about hearing the words, but not understanding the principles. Jesus defended and supported the system under which he was born, because he had come to fulfill that system, and until it was fulfilled, the system was to continue. So we can understand this. And to say that because Jesus did this, I'm following his example, that's another form of ignorance. That's another form of ignorance. You know, it's understanding, it's observing what you saw happening, but not understanding what you saw. So anyway, Paul says he was made under the law. And the reason why this happened, he says in verse 5, it was to redeem or to buy back those who were under the law. That is the people of God who were under this kind of dominion. He came to take them from it, that we might receive the adoption of sons. So what Paul is saying here, he's saying that when people were under the law, they were not treated as sons of God. We received the adoption of sons because of what Jesus did. But before that, we were not sons. Now, what does he mean by this? He says, if you go back to the earlier part of the chapter, he says, even though you are an heir, you are nothing different from a servant. That is what he's talking about. He's saying that you are being treated like a servant. But he says now that Christ has delivered us, we have now received the heritage of sons. And then somebody will say, but were we not sons before, even though we were treated like servants? This is true. But he's making a difference between the way we are practically treated and the way we now have the liberty of behaving. In the former state under the law, we were treated like servants. And if I may explain what that means, I raised 4 children in my home. And I've used this example before, but I like it. So I will use it again and maybe even again. But or maybe I'll go back to when I was a child growing up. I remember some of the My father used to be a pastor when I was a little boy. And so because my mother had so many children so quickly, 5 in a row, in 5 years she had 5 boys. I see mothers today with 1 boy and they can't manage. My mother had 5 in 5 years. So she was pretty stressed out. And because my father at that time could afford it, he was a pastor. We always had somebody to help. I remember Sister Gaynor. I remember Sister Mussington. I remember one named Babes. And I remember several of them. I can barely remember the name. You know why? They came and they went. And sometimes the reason why they went is because they would not perform properly or they would not obey instructions. Some of them were really bad. I remember one of them that offered me a shilling one time if I would say a bad word. I was about 4 years old. She said she would give me a shilling if I said the bad word. I told her no, because Daddy taught me not to say bad words. She said told me to say it first. And I refused. And then she said she would give me a shilling. I was 4 years old. I under my breath, I said the bad word. You know what she did? She went straight to Daddy and told him that I had said this bad word. And when he asked me if it was true, I was 4 years old. I was too stricken at my great sin to even defend myself. So, he took some soap and water and washed out my mouth. But you can tell I never forgot it. So some of the people that came across our pathway in those years, but you know what? They never stayed. You know why? They were not family. They were servants. And it was their duty to do what they were told to do. They were to do what they were told to do. That's the role of a servant. Now, that's not the way a son operates. When you are a son and you come of age, you know what your father does? Your father takes you into the business. Your father has been running the business. And as a little boy, he sent you off to the governors and tutors, right? He sent you off to school to learn. And until you become capable, you're not going to become a part of the business. He doesn't want you to mash up his business. But then finally you graduate and you have your certificate and you understand what you're doing. And he says, I want you to be a partner with me in the business. Now at this point, you're not going to be the servant who sits there making up the books or exchanging cash and just doing exactly what you're told to do. If you're a servant in the business and somebody comes and offers to buy it, you shut your mouth. You don't know anything about that. If somebody comes and says and offers to tell you should make some adjustments, it will make the business work better. That's not your business. Your business is to obey instructions. This is how it was under the law. If you were under the law, you don't adjust the rules. You do what you're told to do. So when Saul was told to wait for the priest before he offered the sacrifice, and when Saul went and offered sacrifice, even though he was the king, Samuel said, the kingdom is going to be taken from you because you have disobeyed the rule. Because to obey is better than sacrifice. Now, there were some people who understood and who had a different relationship with God. In a way, they stepped out of the law and onto a higher place. And it was because they had a special relationship with God. People like David, for example. The showbread, nobody could eat the showbread except the priest. But David actually ate the showbread, and Jesus says he was guiltless. So there were a few people who behaved like sons even under the system of the law. But the principle that governed them was a system of law. You did what you were told. You committed a sin, certain kinds of sin, you got an animal and you killed the animal. You didn't have the option to choose not to do it. When you're a son, it's different. The rules don't control your life. What controls your life is the spirit that is in your heart. This is what Paul is trying to say. And so you see where he says, now we have been adopted as sons. And because you are sons, something has happened. God has sent forth the Spirit of His Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. I like very much the way the apostle, or what the apostle focuses on here. All right, you know that the Spirit has come into your heart. What are some of the benefits? All right, you have been made an heir to heaven, and you're going to walk on golden streets, and you'll have a mansion of your own. What else do you have? You are delivered from sin's penalty and power, and one day you'll be delivered from sin's presence. What else? You know that now you can live a life of victory over sin. You know that now you have power in your life, and you know that even sometimes you might have the ability to heal the sick and raise the dead and all of that. Because you have the Spirit of God. But look at what Paul focuses on. He doesn't mention this. I like what he mentions. What does he say? He says the Spirit has come into your heart. And what does Paul highlight? You now say, Daddy, when you talk to God. You now say, Daddy, when you talk to God. I like that very much. Because, well, first of all, it's a privilege that many people don't value at all. Clearly, Paul values it. And clearly, I think it is one of the greatest benefits of being sons, of having the Spirit of God. So, I've commented on this so much. I'm not going to comment on it again at length here today, but just to point out that it is the feeling you have towards God. The Spirit cries out in you, Abba, Father. It's a feeling you have towards God. It's not a legal position. It's not something that you say, okay, I have been paid for, I've been delivered, so now I may come and say, Daddy. All right, so you can say, Daddy, or you can say, Daddy. One of them is with feeling. One of them comes from your heart. Even when I'm praying in the morning sometimes, it strikes me. We are funny people, but we are always responding to the reality of what goes on. If I have not been so faithful as I want to be, in the morning when I come to pray, I find the first word that comes from my mouth is Daddy or Father. And many times I find myself saying, Daddy. And the tone strikes me. Because the tone is apologetic. The very first word that comes out is apologetic. It sounds second class. Sometimes I stop and I start again. Because I don't want to come to God that kind of way or with that kind of tone. I want to come and say, Dear Daddy, Daddy. I want my tone to reflect the way I feel about Him. Now it's a trivial thing. I'm just saying it because what I want to point out is that it's something like this Paul is talking about, or he's focusing on, when he says the Spirit makes us cry. Abba, Daddy, the Spirit makes us cry. It's not what you ought to. It's what you feel in your heart. And this is the wonderful nature of the Christian experience. We are not only, this is what so many, unfortunately, who go by the name of Christian don't understand. I admit, I'm going to say something about Brother Gregory's presentation. And I admit that in many ways, my own experience as a Christian, there are limitations in my ministry, all right? Because I've never been able to do a presentation on family life like he has done. But I'm going to excuse myself and tell you why. I live under an illusion, which may be not an illusion. I've lived under this from the moment I became a Christian, that if you become a Christian, the Spirit changes you naturally. So I've always felt that this Spirit in me will make me treat my wife right, will make me treat my children right, will make me behave right, will make me know how I ought to operate. And so I don't need these kinds of counsels. And I'm saying, I think I may be a little at fault, but I've always felt this way. And many times when people have come to me and said, Brother David, can you give me some counsel, or can you have some sessions on family life? I've normally felt, oh boy, I feel like there's something lacking here, because the Spirit of Christ should teach us everything naturally. Now, I believe that is true. I believe that is true. And I acknowledge a lot of what has happened in my life, even in terms of my children, my family life, it has been because God has been working in me. But at the same time, what I have recognized over the years is that it is unreasonable and unfair to think that everybody is at the same place in their Christian experience. And so I'm saying this to say, to just explain why I appreciate so much like what Gregory did this morning and things like this, because we are not all at the same place. And even those of us who have the Spirit of Christ in us and we are being directed personally, we still are helped by even those reminders of these principles. And then those who are not yet at that place, it can mean a great deal to them. So I'm trying to balance it out here in what I'm saying. But Paul says our main reason is because the Spirit has been put in our hearts. So the religion of Jesus Christ, we have been placed in a different place, not just because Jesus came and died for us, but because Jesus came and lives in us. He came and lives in us. That is the aspect of it that is so beautiful, transforming, and so important, which is probably not emphasized enough. What he did for me is great, but let us not forget what he does in me. That is the thing. And, I pray that the Lord might help us to focus on this more. Because, forgiveness, we talk about it. Forgiveness is a product of Christ living in me. Holiness is a product of Christ living in me. Tolerance is a product of Christ living in me. Every time somebody says, Brother David, you show a lot of patience, I smile, because I know that by nature, it's not me. I know that the Lord is helping me because he's in me and trying to enable me to be what I ought to be. But that is what he does for all of us. That is what he does for all of us. It is a fruit of Christ living in us. And so that is what Paul points to. In verse 7 he says, wherefore thou art no more a servant. You see, he's making a difference between servants and sons. Right? So you are no more a servant. That means you are no longer the one referred to in the first verse. You are no different from a servant. That's the person who is under the tutors and governors are under the law. And it belongs to the church or to the people of God when it was in a state of infancy. And as a result, they were put under worldly elements. They were governed by external elements belonging to this world. And it says, no, but now that Jesus has put his Spirit in your heart, you are no longer a servant. You are done with that lifestyle. You are now a son. And if you're a son, then you're an heir of God through Christ. You have become one who inherits the promise. You're Abraham's seed. And the promise made to Abraham is yours. Now I'd like to explain the next maybe 4 verses, and then I'm going to stop. Now these 4 verses are a little tricky, and I'm going to take my time because even when I've explained it before, I've had people who accept everything except my understanding of these 4 verses. And that means I need to explain what I'm saying very carefully now, because I would like to be understood. At least even if you don't agree, I want you to know the reasons why I believe what I believe. And there's still somebody scribbling on the screen. Let me get rid of that. All right. Now Paul says, howbeit then, when you knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods. Now, who is he talking to? He says at one point, because they didn't know God, you knew not God, they were serving them, whoever is them, which by nature are no gods. Who is he talking to? And who are these, or what are these things that by nature are no gods? Now, to understand this properly, I've heard what people have said to me is that this is talking about the pagan gods that the Galatians used to worship. The Galatians used to worship pagan idols, maybe Greek gods like Zeus and Apollo and all the rest of them. And they say these Galatians were worshiping these false gods. I don't think that is what he was saying. That is where there is disagreement between what I see and what some people say. I think he's still talking about the law. And the reason why I think so is because everything that he has been talking about so far has to do with the law. He's talking about when there were servants. He's talking about when there were children. He's talking about when they were under the elements of the world. And then he says, howbeit then, at that time in the past, why would he change suddenly and start talking about something else on a different time and a different situation? For me, it doesn't make sense. The context of what he has been saying coming all along is about the people of God who were in a state of infancy, who were under these governors and tutors, who were under elements of the world. This is what I think this is meaning. He says you were under the elements of the world. Are the elements of the world gods by nature? When they went to the tabernacle and they brought their sacrifices, were they involved with things which are gods by nature? Their entire religious structure by nature are not gods, and they are not divine things. By nature, these are elements of the world. Even though their entire religious system was wrapped up in this, by nature, there are no gods at all. And Paul says, you did service unto them. This is what they were doing. Now, some people disagree, and they say it is talking about the pagan gods. But let me show you what follows in the next couple of verses. Because the truth is, you knew not God. Now, just to put that in context, somebody might say, but the Hebrews, the Israelites knew God. And generally speaking, that is not true. Generally speaking, that is not true. If you listen to even Jesus teaching them, he said to them, if God were your father, he says to them, this is life eternal, that they might know you, the only true God. Everything that you see them doing, he says, if you knew him, this is what you would have done. But the Jews in general did not know God. What they knew was their religious system. They were worshipping things which by nature are no gods. They were not worshipping the God of gods. That is what Jesus' ministry and his statements say to me. And Paul is saying the same thing. What he's trying to show them, I mean, the whole point of Paul in this passage is to show that the system that existed before was not adequate. It was not something that these Galatians should find themselves becoming involved in again. That's the point he's making. So he's saying at that time, you were serving things which by nature are not gods. But he says, look at verse 9. But now, after that you have known God. When did they come to know God? It was when the Apostle Paul introduced God to them. When Paul brought the gospel to them, they came to know God. Or rather, you are known of God. Now here's what he says. How turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage. So it's very clear the things that they are getting into is the things that they were into before. The weak, you are turning again. You are going back to the weak and beggarly elements. What is he talking about? Whatever they are going back to, that is what they were involved in before. And if you look at what it says next, verse 10, you observe days and months and times and years. That is what they were doing. That is what Paul says they are doing when he says they are going back to the weak and beggarly elements. So the question is, which days and months and times and years? A friend of mine who is a feast keeper tells me that these were the pagan holidays like Christmas and Easter and all of that. because he does not want to accept that Paul is talking about the Jewish feast days, days and months and times and years. In this entire book, Paul is not talking about the pagan behavior of the Galatians. Paul is talking about the legalistic, law-oriented behavior of the Galatians. That is the problem. The problem is not paganism. The problem is Judaism in the entire book of Galatians. And so the days and months and times of years here is the Jewish days and times. This is one of the reasons why I do not take feast keeping lightly. Some people say, well, they want to keep the feast days, let them go ahead. I mean, people should be free to do what they want to do, but I will preach against it because I believe it is Paul says that if you go back to this, you are going back into bondage. And I'm going to show you what he says. He says, you desire. So I'm just going to jump to a verse. I see you, Ann. I'm going to jump to a verse that tells you what it is they were desiring. Jump down to verse 20 and you'll see what they were desiring. Paul says, 21, verse 21. Tell me, you that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? Now, Paul says that what they desired was to be under the law. They wanted again to be governed by the law. Why? Because people were deceiving them and telling them that Christ was not enough. They also needed to keep the law. The Jewish fallacy. You have to keep the law along with being justified by faith. And Paul says, tell me you that desire. Notice the word desire. It's what they wanted. And if you go back to verse 10, verse 9, he says, you desire, you want, desire, there's that word again. You desire again to be in bondage. You want to go back to the bondage of the law. You want to go back under the weak and beggarly elements. The word beggarly can be misleading because a beggar is somebody who sits at the roadside and begs. That's not what the word means here. It's from a Greek word and it means poor. It means impotent, helpless. The law was weak. It made nothing perfect. The weak and the impotent elements, we saw this already, elements of the world. You want to go back to this kind of religion is what Paul is saying. You want again to be in bondage. You want to be in bondage like children under the law. Go ahead, Ian. Yeah, Brother Ian, not hearing you. All right. I just have the other verse to look at, and then maybe he'll get his thing fixed up by the time we come to the end. So Paul says, and Paul makes it clear what it is. First of all, you read through the book of Galatians and you'll see that the problem was they wanted to be circumcised. They wanted to be Jews. They wanted to be under the law. And then he goes on to say what else they were doing. Now they had started observing days, months, times, and years. They were observing the feast days. So feast days, circumcision, next thing they would be offering sacrifices. They were going back in every way to the law because these Jews came down from Jerusalem and were confounding the truth that they had received from Paul, were confusing their minds, were bringing them again into bondage. And just to reemphasize, it was bondage to the law. Not bondage to sin necessarily, bondage to the law. And so Paul ends by saying, I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid for you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. I'm afraid that I was working for you for nothing. And just to emphasize, this is the first time he makes this point. No. He says it in chapter 3, he says it here in chapter 4, and if you look at chapter 5, he says it again, because in chapter 5 he says, Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, you have fallen from grace. So when he says, I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain, what he's saying is that, how did I end up here? What he's saying is that I am afraid I'm afraid. I'm afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you. I'm afraid that you're going to lose your salvation. I'm afraid that Christ will become of no effect unto you because you have gone back to the way of the law. So I'm going to stop there for today because we have run out of time. But we are going to continue by God's grace. I hope we can continue next week. But I know that for many of us this is like a review of some of the things we have looked at already, but a very important review. It does to refresh our minds concerning these things. We live in a world and we are in a religious atmosphere where there are many, many different ideas floating around. And one of the things, especially in our circles, one of the things we will certainly meet are sincere, are well-meaning brothers and sisters who will try to tell us that the law must be intruded into our walk of faith. They'll try to make out, I mean, they won't get you back into, they won't try to get you back into feast days or try to get, well, they will. Some of them will. And they'll try to get you back into other aspects of the, what is called the ceremonial law. But more subtle is the idea that those other aspects of the law are done, but you are still under obligation to the Ten Commandments. That is another subtle form of legalism. The Ten Commandments are the product, or the walking in harmony with the Ten Commandments are the fruit of Christ living inside. They are not the way to obtain that relationship, and they are not the important aspect of that relationship by any means. They're a side product. Christ is the gift. Christ is the pearl of great price. Christ is the goal. And when we have found him, our relationship with God has been restored. That's what Paul is saying, and that's what I wanted to emphasize today. I appreciate you all listening so attentively. God bless you all.